Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Debbie Ingalls. I'm the director of the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute here at Brock University, and welcome to our 2024 lecture series. So for our opening lecture, I would like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Antonia Mantonakis. She's been a CCOVI Fellow affiliated with the Institute for many years now. Antonia is a professor of marketing and consumer psychology with the Goodman School of Business here at Brock University, and has been at Brock for over 2 decades now.
Nearly 2 decades.
Yes, we're aging ourselves here, Antonia. Now, she is recognized for expertise in consumer psychology, with her research funded both through NSERC and also through SSHRC. These are very competitive research programs that Antonia has been able to delve into to do the work some of the work that I'm sure she's going to be presenting to us today. She's also been featured on international outlets such as NPR, CNN, the Financial Times, the Globe and Mail, and the New Yorker. So these are pretty prestigious publications and news outlets that are not just focused here in Canada, but really worldwide. Antonia's accomplishments have also been recognized at the Kilt Scholar at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, and she's also a visiting scholar at Columbia Business School. Most recently, Antonia has been awarded the prestigious title of runner-up in the 2023 Top PR Marketing and Communications Professors and Instructors by Marketing News Canada. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mantonakis to speak to us today about her ongoing research.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie, for the warm welcome, and thank you all for joining in person today and online. I just want to start by explaining where the name The Wine Psychologist comes from. So when we were doing our PhDs, my classmates, as we were graduating, some were becoming clinical psychologists, some were becoming forensic psychologists. I was studying consumer psychology. And because I was hired here in the Niagara region, and I was encouraged by my dean at the time and my colleagues to study the consumer psychology of wine, one of my classmates said, "So then you're the wine psychologist." So that's where the name came from, and that name just stuck. So as Debbie mentioned, I'm a consumer psychologist. I work here at Brock University. I am at the Goodman School of Business, and I'm also a CCOVI Fellow. What do I do outside of the university? I've worked with a number of wineries here in the Niagara region, and that's some of the research I'm going to be sharing with you today. I've done some marketing audits with wineries, but most of all, I see that people joining me in the room today, everyone is at various stages of your careers. I see, some students here in the audience. And there are different areas of wine business everyone is in, from grape growing to winemaking. But I think what we all have in common, I think we're all consumers of wine. And so what I hope that everyone takes away from today's presentation is a little bit more knowledge about consumer psychology and how it can help you not only in your business or whatever area of wine business you're in, but also for you yourself as a consumer of wine. All right, so I take a consumer psychology approach to wine. So first question I want to ask you to think about is, why is this important? Why consider consumer psychology of wine? Okay, and so I want to ask the audience, and I know I have some of my current and former students from wine marketing and consumer behavior here with us today. So what is the very first marketing decision a winemaker has to make? The very first marketing decision. What is that? And if you're joining us online, you can contribute in the chat any answers. So it's the very first marketing decision. Daniel?
Is this like hypothetical, like they're already established, or are they starting to seek what their brand's going to be like?
Okay, so I think you're kind of giving them the answer there. Okay, so is it something established? Is there a brand? So we have to think about what is the branding element that might come into play. Okay, that's a good response. Anything else? What might even come before then?
Who's the target consumer?
Who's the target consumer, right? Who's the target market, right? And, you know, according to some experts in the field, they say even the very first marketing decision is which grape to plant, right? What's the grape, right? So that's so far even removed from the consumer end of the value chain, right? And then when we think about, well, what's the last marketing decision? Right? And then that also gets back to the branding elements, the packaging, right? All of these other more consumer-driven elements of that decision. And so I'm going to be talking today about consumer psychology and how important it is throughout all of the stages in the value chain, from grape to glass. And I am going to argue today that whatever area, whatever stage of this process you might work in or be interested in, it's very important to understand consumer psychology throughout all of these stages of this process. Okay, so I like to break consumer decision-making down into 3 separate stages. Okay? Because before consumers even take in a sip, there's that distinct buying phase or that choice phase. So this could be in a bricks and mortar retail store. This could also be in a tasting room, or it can also be online. So that's a separate buying phase. And so I look at what are some factors that come into play during this stage. Next is the consumption experience. So this is what factors might have an impact on the consumption of the wine, right? And this, again, could be consumers by themselves, it could be in a group setting, right? Lots of factors come into play during this stage. And then finally, the 3rd stage, which I think is equally important to the first 2 stages, is the remembering stage. How does the person remember that experience? How did that experience make them feel? What are they going to talk about in terms of the experience, right? So the word of mouth that might happen. And that might also influence subsequent searches online or repeat purchases, right? So that's also an important stage. So now when it comes to the first stage, that initial buying stage, I want to ask the audience, what is important that a consumer might look at or look for in that buying stage? So what influences are important? What cues do they use? Yes, Jason?
Kind of being a little bit early in my wine consumption journey.
Okay.
Typically price has a larger bearing on my purchase.
Price. So a consumer, one of the first things people say when I ask this question is, they look at price, right? That's a cue that a consumer uses to make a decision often, okay? Anything else? Is there anything else, Laura?
I'd say the attractiveness of the packaging.
Right, the packaging, the attractiveness, the appeal. Is there some feature on the label that might grab a person's attention, right? So these are some of the cues that a consumer might use. And so I want to break this down into 2 separate kinds of cues. The ones that were mentioned just now, I would group into extrinsic cues. These are cues that a marketer generally controls or has control over. These are factors such as the price, whether there's a award or a rating that's been included in the labeling, the packaging, the style of the label, whether it's a fun, funky label or a more traditional label, right? These are things that can be changed after bottling. And we contrast that with intrinsic cues. Intrinsic cues are inherent to the product, that you can't go back, a marketer can't go back and change these after the fact, right? You can't go back and change the country of origin or the grape variety, for instance, right? So these are things that are inherent to the product. So my research today is going to focus on the extrinsic cues side. And one recent example I want to share with you, there was an article in the Wine Enthusiast, I'm not sure how many of you have seen this, but it shows how the best wine influencers are paid in treats. And so more and more wineries are using their puppies as part of their Instagrams and part of that experience of visiting the vineyard. This is my favorite one. The caption is really small, but it says that the puppy's gone full babushka mode with the scarf. So, very cute. And, this is an extrinsic cue. This is outside of the product of wine, but consumers love it. It makes consumers feel great. And so in my previous research, I have uncovered many different extrinsic factors that have come into play at each of these 3 stages. And I've presented a lot of these at previous CCOVI lectures, and you can find those online, and I'm always happy to talk about them separately if anyone is interested. So for extrinsic cues, I've shown how this order of sampling, or whether there's a photo on a label or not, how those have an effect on consumers. I've looked at the name of the winery, and I've also looked at the remembering stage. Most recently, I have a paper that I have not talked about at a previous CCOVI lecture on corporate social responsibility or irresponsibility messages. So I just want to spend 1 minute talking about this previous study. So what do I mean by corporate social responsibility, or CSR initiatives? Well, oftentimes a winery might, for example, donate $1 for each bottle sold to a charitable donation. So that's a corporate social responsibility initiative. Consumers generally like that, and that's very positive. But what happens if it's a consumer hears about a corporate social irresponsibility message associated with a brand or a firm? So this might be an example of that the employees were treated poorly, or there were some allegations of some kind of misconduct, or even further, if the owner has admitted to that these allegations are true. What does that do for the consumer? And in our research, we show that when they taste the product associated with these allegations, it literally leaves a bad taste in their mouth. They report that their perceptions are worse. Okay? And so and so this is what my research is about, is with all these extrinsic cues, these extrinsic messages, and how they can have an effect on consumers, how and why does this happen? Why does this occur? And so this is what consumer psychology is. It's the perceptions that the consumer has. It's what they pay attention to, how they take in that information along with their sensations, and how they feel about it, what they think about it, and how those thoughts and feelings influence subsequent buying decisions and their consumption experience, and later their remembering of those experiences. Okay, so that's what my research has focused on. And so if we go back to all of these topics and all of the extrinsic cues that I outlined earlier, each one of those has an accompanying psychological mechanism that is involved in the process. And so what I try to do is uncover some of these secrets of consumer psychology behind what's happening. So going back to that corporate social irresponsibility example I shared earlier, what we uncovered in that study is that when people are tasting a product that's been associated with a corporate social irresponsibility message, they actually feel guilt. They feel guilty. And so they taste the product. Not only do they think it tastes bad, but they report saying, you know what, I feel bad. Like there's that bad feeling that then kind of gets transferred onto the taste of the product. And so you can see here that for all of these, I've done the same. I've looked at what the psychological mechanisms are. However, today, I'm really excited to talk about one of these, and that's the concept of identity. Okay? That's the one I'm going to focus on today. Now, what do I mean when I talk about consumer identity? Now, each one of you in this room and joining us online has a self-concept that contains characteristics of your identity, right? So you can, you don't have to say it out loud, but think about what they are for you, right? Because each one of you has a unique set of characteristics that's unique to your self-concept. So imagine Claudia, okay? Claudia's self-concept includes being a competitive cyclist. Claudia is also a physician. Claudia is a mom. And Claudia is an American. Now, Claudia lives in Canada, but she's American. Okay, and so what influence might these aspects of her self-concept have on her consumer behavior? Well, previous research in consumer psychology shows that one's self-concept does have an impact on their consumer behavior. So let me illustrate this with Claudia. So imagine Claudia, who lives in Canada, is somehow made aware of her American identity. Let's say she sees an American flag, okay, and she's in Canada. Previous research in consumer psychology has shown that in a situation like this, Claudia would have a higher evaluation for American products like Budweiser beer, but have a lower evaluation of Canadian products like Molson Canadian beer. Okay, so based on this previous research, that leads us to today's research question, which is in collaboration with my co-author, Dr. Carrie Kettle. Dr. Carrie Kettle is the first author on this paper. I'm the second author, and he is an expert on consumer identity. He's also a consumer psychologist. He's a professor at the University of Ottawa. And Carrie has published a paper on the influence of a signature on consumers. So what does that look like? What's the connection there? Now, you all have a personal signature, I'm sure that you've used at some point in your life, right? And what is a signature? A signature represents an aspect of you, of your identity. A signature represents who you are. Right? A signature can be an endorsement, it could be used for approval, it could even be used by an artist, for instance, to demonstrate authenticity. And so at the time when Carrie approached me for this collaboration, this was over 10 years ago, we started to notice signatures in the marketplace. So here you can see an example of a signature on a Papa John's pizza box, and that's Papa John's signature. And so the question then became, can a signature be a cue or somehow relate to a consumer's identity? And if that's the case, can a signature, maybe of a signer like Papa John, can that act as an extrinsic cue in the packaging? Now, just like the other extrinsic cues we talked about earlier. And so if that's the case, we thought, well, if we have a wine, a label of a wine, and we add a winemaker's signature, what is that going to do to consumer behavior? Okay, so that's the question that I'm so excited to talk about with you all today. So at the time, I approached Mike Pelletieri from Riverview Cellars Estate Winery. Riverview Cellars is just about 20 minutes here from Brock University. It's on the Niagara River. And at the time when I approached Mike with this idea, and that's an aerial view of the farm, you can see the river there. At the time, Riverview had a Chardonnay, okay, that had the winemaker's signature on the label, and this was new for them. The previous vintage, the Chardonnay, was the same price point, same tasting notes, pretty much the same. The only difference was that this year's Chardonnay had the winemaker's signature. And so we got to talking about the sales data, was there any change, and we were so excited to find out that that new label with the winemaker's signature was associated with an increase in sales for the Chardonnay. Okay, so we started talking about this, analyzing it, we were very excited about it, and you know, that led to a lot more research that we did. However, this was just more of an observed effect. I mean, sales for a wine could go up for a number of reasons. Maybe Chardonnay became more popular that year across the board for everyone. So we don't really know what else was happening, but nonetheless, it was a very exciting time for us, and we decided to take this further. And this is a part of my title I want to pause and talk about here because I included "It's Not What You Think." Okay? Because 10 years ago, when we first started sharing the results of this research, and it wasn't just the Chardonnay research we were sharing, Carrie and I ran a bunch of other experiments online with online panels. We used pizza boxes, perceptions of qualities of pizza and other consumer products, not just wine. We were very excited about it. I presented some of this data at the Academy of Wine Business Research Conference and other business and wine conferences. There were signatures everywhere, actually. We started to notice more and more signatures on wine labels. Even people would stop me and say, oh, you did the signature studies. I heard about that at a conference. However, I was also talking to people, like a friend of mine who works in a tasting room here in the region, and said, Antonia, your signature thing, it works in the tasting room. We found that in a tasting room, the label that has a signature, people like it. But how come it's not working in the LCBO? Right? Why isn't it working? And to that, I said, well, we haven't done any studies in the LCBO. And the LCBO is totally different, right? In the LCBO, it's about the consumer's attention, maybe even prior knowledge and awareness to know what to look for. And then when they find it, it's a matter of that connection to want to pick it up off the shelf, right? Because consumer psychology research shows that if a consumer picks up a bottle off the shelf, and this isn't just for wine, this is any bottle, shampoo, soda, they pick it up off the shelf, they're 80% likely to purchase that bottle, okay? And so if there's that connection, that attention, that orientation where the consumer does pick it up off the shelf in the LCBO and they read the story and they turn it around and they see the signature, then there would be an effect. Okay, so in that situation, I would say it's an attention, perception issue. It's not anything that we have studied. So we have to, at the end of the presentation today, what I want you to take away from this research is that sometimes a signature will help, and sometimes a signature will hurt. Okay, so I just wanted to preference our results by saying that. So let's go back to our data that I'm so excited to present today. So in our first experiment, we came up with this experiment idea with Mike Pilateri at Riverview Cellars. We ran this experiment during the Taste the Season Festival. This happens every November in the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where 20 participating wineries feature a wine and food pairing, and people who purchase the pass can go from winery to winery and get their sample of food and wine. And what we did in this, it was a very simple experiment. What we did is we manipulated the kind of sign that was displayed on the tasting wine. Okay, so for their featured wine at Riverview, it was a Gewürztraminer. It was a 2012 Gewürztraminer, and on the first weekend in November for the festival, we displayed a sign that looks like this, featuring the featured wine, with the winemaker's signature not present on the sign. And the following weekend, we showed the same sign featuring the wine, although we included the winemaker's signature. And Angela Casimos was the winemaker at the time, and she's also a Brock grad. And throughout the 4 weekends of this festival, where we tracked sales of this featured wine, we had over 1,600 people come through with this Taste the Season pass. So what did the data show in terms of number of bottles of the featured wine sold? Well, here are the data, and you can see here that weekend 1, where there was no signature present, 21 bottles of the featured wine were sold. But that number jumps to 27 on the subsequent weekend, where the sign featured the winemaker's signature. Weekend 3, when there was no signature on the sign, 20 bottles were sold, but that number jumped to 28 on the 4th weekend, where the signature was present on the sign. So what is happening here? How is this happening? What is going on? What is the signature doing to people? What is it making them feel like? And this was a question we sat down with Mike on numerous occasions trying to figure out what is going on. And we started to ask him, what do you find? Is it more local people coming in? Are there tourists coming in? Who are the people coming through with this Taste the Seasons Pass? And so we started to think, hey, maybe that matters. Maybe this effect is based on who the consumer is. Where are they coming from? Because in their based on the location, the geographic location of the Riverview Cellars, it's right by the border. So there are a lot of consumers who come and visit from across the border, and a lot of consumers from here in Ontario. And so what we tried to do in our next experiment was come up with an experiment where we can try to maybe understand a little bit more of who the consumers are, where they're coming from, and how they might be connecting with the signature. And so at the time, they were featuring their newly released Malbec. It wasn't the 2021, it was older vintage at the time we did the study. And what we did is we tried to pick a month during which the winery wasn't busy there were no festivals, there was nothing going on in terms of Ice Wine Festival or Days of Wine and Chocolate, nothing of that nature was going on. And we did something very similar to what we did with the tasting bar sign study. We put a sign outside the winery that said, tasting event today, okay? And so when people came into the winery and said, I saw a sign outside, we're here, we'd like to learn about this tasting event, they were directed to the back bar of the winery where they were greeted by my research assistants and myself. And we said, well, today we're featuring our new Malbec, would you like to sample a taste? And on the first weekend, we showed the label of the Malbec without the winemaker's signature. And on the second weekend, we showed the same label with the winemaker's signature. So similar to the previous study, except now instead of being on a tasting bar sign, it's on the label itself. Okay? And we gave people, so we had over 180 people come in over the weekends. There's another shot of the winery, and this is the little survey that we gave them as part of the study. And in the survey, we asked questions like, how do you evaluate the taste of the wine? How would you rate the quality of the wine? And the important question that every tasting room staff asks, from where are you visiting us today? That was the most important question that we asked. And on that little survey sheet, we also reproduced the back of the label again so that we made sure that they saw it. And we also told them that in exchange for participation in our short survey, they could bring this completed questionnaire for $2 off any purchase at the winery today. And so what we did then, the cash stapled this response card, so it doesn't have any identifying information, so they stapled it to a copy of their receipt, so it was completely anonymous, and we were able to take a look at where they were from and what they purchased. And in terms of where they're from, Mike had the idea to break down the participants into where they were from in terms of the predominant areas that visit the winery. Because it's an Ontario winery, the Ontario consumers, we grouped these and called them as having an associative identity. Ontario winery, Ontario consumer. There's an association there. There's a connection there. For the consumers who were from the US, and they were generally from these 3 states here, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, okay? Because it's an Ontario winery, for these consumers, we put them in a dissociative identity condition, okay? Because Ontario winery, US consumer, okay? So now just really quickly for any stats enthusiasts in the audience, what we showed was when there was a personal signature on the label, it did have an effect on product purchase, and this was mediated by their product evaluations, but only for the people from Ontario. So this is a moderated mediation. What is that in simple terms? In simple terms, 14 bottles of the Malbec were purchased. throughout this experiment. And just to give you a comparison, for the entire prior month before we ran the experiment, 11 bottles were sold. So that just gives you a point of comparison. But when were these, in which experimental condition were these bottles purchased? Well, when there was a signature on the label, 12 bottles were purchased. When there was no signature on the label, only 2 bottles were purchased. And that is for the Ontario consumers. Now, you may look at this number and think, oh, 12 bottles, no big deal, but that's a 500% increase. You know, for a marketer, that's huge. That's a big difference. That is a very exciting difference. Okay? And this was, very interesting and very informative that it was the Ontario consumers. But now you may be wondering, well, is it that it's the Ontario consumers buying it, or is it that the US consumers are not buying it because they have to cross back over the border? And there are restrictions when you cross the border as to how many bottles of wine you can bring and for how long your stay was in Canada. And so maybe it has nothing to do with the signature or the identity. Maybe it has to do with restrictions at the border. And that's a very valid question. And this is something that we wanted to address in our subsequent experiments. The other question that came up at this point is this idea of self-importance of identity. So throughout this research and presenting this research, the question we would get is, well, some people really strongly identify with being from Ontario, right? It's a very important aspect of their identity. Other people, it's maybe not as important to them. They don't strongly identify with it. So they have a low self-importance. And so that's another question that we attempted to address in our subsequent experiments. So in experiments 3 and 4, I'm just going to describe them both, and then I'll just show you the data for one because it replicates again and again. We used an online panel, and we didn't use wine because we didn't want to have any there's no question about the border anymore, no question about alcohol per se, but it's more about the identity and the packaging and whether it was associative or dissociative. And so what we did in this pancake mix study is we showed product packaging to an online panel. Oh, and the online panel, this is MTurf, this is Amazon Mechanical Turk. So these are participants who participate online in exchange for payment. And we can ask them questions like, where are you from? Where's your home state? And to what extent do you identify with that home state? How important is it to you that you are from that home state? And so we showed the product packages to the participants either without the signature or with the signature. And the signatures are circled here. I know it's small and it's hard to see. And then we either told them that the founder of the company was from whatever home state they inserted in the earlier question. So if they said, I'm from Wisconsin, and they were in the associative condition, we said, oh, the founder of the company for this product you're evaluating is also from Wisconsin. Okay, so that's the associative condition. In the dissociative condition, we told them that the founder of the company was from Canada. Okay, so that's dissociative in this case, because they were American participants. So that's experiment 3 with the pancake mix. In experiment 4, we did the same thing with cheeses. So again, we showed the cheese without the farmer's signature, and we showed the cheese packaged with the farmer's signature. We asked people where they're from, what's their home state, and then in one condition, we told them the farmer was from the same home state as you, so that's the associative condition. And in the other condition, we told them the farmer is from Canada. And you can see that that's the dissociative condition. Okay, so I'm going to show you the data here, but before I present them, I just want to describe what I'm about to show you. So along the y-axis here, this is the product evaluations. And again, this replicates, so whether you were talking about the pancake mix or the cheese, it's the same results across the board. On the left here is the results for the associative identity condition. So this is same state, farmers from the same state as you. And on the right, I'm going to report the dissociative identity condition. This is when we told them that the founder or the farmer is from Canada. Across the bottom, this is the measure of self-importance. Remember, we also ask, how important is it to you? So the person says, I'm from Wisconsin. How important is that to you, to your self-importance, to your identity? So I'll show you the associative identity condition first. I want you to draw your attention to this dark line here. The dark line with the higher product evaluations, that's for the condition where the signature was present on the packaging. And so you can see that across all levels of self-importance, it gets stronger as we get higher, but across all levels, when there was a signature present and the farmer was from the same state as the person, they thought the product was better quality. However, when we look at the dissociative condition, so we tell them that the founder's from Canada or the farmer's from Canada, draw your attention to this dark line here. You see the results are flipped. People have a lower evaluation. They think that the cheese is lower quality when they hear that the farmer is from Canada, when they see the signature. On this side, with the associative condition, the signature is helping. In the dissociative condition, it's hurting. Okay? All right. One more study I want to describe today, because we've gotten a lot of questions about, does this work for celebrity signatures? Does it have to be a farmer? And so we did a supplemental study with a watch ad featuring Derek Jeter. Now, Derek Jeter is an American baseball player who spent his entire career playing for the New York Yankees. And so he would represent three distinct identities: American, Yankees, and the sport of baseball. And what we did, very simple experiment, two groups of participants. One group saw the watch ad with no signature, and the second group saw the ad with Derek Jeter's signature on it. And while the results replicate regardless of which identity we focus on, just for simplicity, I'm going to just describe the condition that focuses on the sport of baseball identity. So when the respondents in this online panel reported that they do identify with the sport of baseball, and they saw the watch ad with the signature, they had higher evaluations towards that watch. Okay. However, if the respondents reported that they do not identify with the sport of baseball, and they saw the signature on the ad, they rated the watch less favorably. So they had lower evaluations towards the watch. Okay, so again, we're showing the same results throughout all of these experiments. And so the takeaways, what I want to take away from all these results is that, it's not so simple. So what I've shown is that the effect of the signature depends on two main things. One is whether the consumer's related identity is associative, so Ontario winery, Ontario consumer, okay, versus dissociative, and how important that related identity is to that consumer. Right? If it's really important to them that they're from Ontario, then it's going to have more of an effect. Okay. So adding a personal signature can act as an extrinsic cue. Now we can add this to our list of extrinsic cues that can have an impact on a consumer and how they decide. Okay, and so I just want to reiterate again that in some cases a signature will help, and in some cases a signature will hurt. And so when your consumer's related identity is associative, right, so this is Ontario winery, Ontario consumer, a signature will help. And so in a tasting room situation, it might be very easy to showcase a signature, right? On the other hand, in the LCBO, it's not as easy because attention, it has to be drawn to that label or to that section of the store. There's so many more factors that come into play in an LCBO, and so the key here is that 80% rule that I mentioned earlier. Is how do we get the consumer first to pick up the bottle, and then we worry about the signature? And finally, when your consumer's related identity is dissociative, so this might be a situation where there might be visitors from outside of Ontario for an Ontario winery, or tourists coming in that may not relate to that winery being an Ontario winery, then a signature might hurt. Okay, so I want to go over some managerial implications and some do's and don'ts. So do consider consumer psychology. Do take a look at how a consumer is thinking, what a consumer is feeling, what's going on in their mindset. Do analyze the buying context, what the situation is where the signature might be relevant or might become salient, right? What is that buying context? What will the consumer identify with? Okay. Don't just add a signature for aesthetic appeal. Okay. Even though it might look nice, it might not have the results that are intended. And finally, don't just add a signature before considering the consumer identities that might be at play. And in terms of practical implications, I just want to highlight that throughout all the experiments I presented today, we've looked at both categories of products, so more the luxury end, right, with the watches, wine, and more of the everyday consumer goods, more utilitarian products like pancake mixes and pizza. Okay, so regardless of what kind of label design, right, so whether it's for wine or other product packaging, the results hold. And also, I mentioned that the first experiment at Riverview was just a manipulation of in-store signage. So in some cases, we didn't even change the label. It was more a sign that was separate or removed from the actual product label. And in both cases, it worked. And finally, this is something to share with tasting room staff. To explain the results of research like this. And I'm always happy to come in and speak to anyone's staff if anyone is interested in this. As we wrap up today, I want to give a very special thanks to Mike Piliteri at Riverview Cellars and to my research team who helped look at drafts of this presentation. And I invite you all to connect with me on social media if we haven't already. And please take a look at my website and read more about my research. And thank you so much for being here today and for listening.
So we've got time for questions. Anybody wants to start off?
I have so many questions. I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start with a really basic question. You've got some data there, and you've got your dissociative and your associative identities. Have you started to look underneath that as to the why? Because it's one thing to say, well, they don't, but my first question that popped into my head was, well, why? Like, what's going on? What's underneath that behavior?
So when you say what's underneath that behavior, do you think it might be like an emotion or a feeling?
Yeah, I guess yes. Because I'm wondering, well, is it, if they're not associating, say, American versus Ontario consumers, right? Is it that they just don't have that emotional connection? And it may be very difficult to understand that. But even the study with the cheese or the pancakes, like, what is it that they would go, it's not as good a product, because really the quality of the product is separate from their perception, correct?
Yeah.
So the perception then, the question to my mind becomes, well, what's going on? Why are they making that decision? Can you even find out why?
Yeah, and that's what the point of this research is, to see what are they connecting with, and that's where the deepest layer that we got into was about the self-concept and the identity of somebody maybe even feeling like, well, that's not me, right? And I think, and I tried, and I think I felt this way when I was looking at the Derek Jeter study, where if I look at, the American identity primed, or even the baseball identity, and feeling like I don't That's not interesting to me. That's not relevant to me. That's not something that is part of my self